Would be making your way in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 21. This is where we left off last time. At this point in 2 Kings, looking at the life of Manasseh, who was the king of Judah, followed after the death of his father Hezekiah. And as we saw last week, Manasseh took over from a very early age, reigned a relative, not just relative, but directly reigned for a very long time, right? 55 years in Jerusalem. And a long reign sometimes was associated with kings that did well, as evident by people like David. But as we saw last week, Manasseh, on the other hand, reigns a long time, but that does not indicate that he was a good king at all. In fact, verse 2 simply says that he did evil in the sight of the Lord and brought back a level of evil to Judah that had not been seen perhaps since Athaliah had served as essentially the queen of Israel for several decades earlier. Of course, Athaliah being connected to the family of Ahab, Manasseh, not necessarily being directly related to the house of Ahab, but bringing back a lot of the things that Athaliah had introduced into Judah, and for that he is remembered as an evil king. Where we left off last week, we were talking about the specific things that God, through inspiration, needed to mention that he had a problem with. And those are things, and these are obviously numerous problems. We talked about that in verse 2. One of the things that Manasseh did is that he reintroduced practices that the people of Israel had, or rather, he introduced practices that the people before the children of Israel were in the land of Canaan, what the Bible just reports in verse 2 as being abominations. Those things had been brought back, and that he had a direct hand in doing that. And remember that the significance of that is simply because that we know from the book of Joshua and from Deuteronomy and the earlier books in the Old Testament that the requirement for the people of Judah, or rather for the people of Israel at that point in time, was that they had to completely eliminate all of those abominable practices that the Canaanites both enjoyed and had established as part of their religion. Those things had to go away in order for the people of Israel to survive. And that point was very clear. We know throughout Israel's history that they often still had problems because they failed to completely eliminate these ideas during the conquest of Canaan, as we saw in the book, as we can see in the book of Joshua. So those things are reintroduced. He talks about again in verse 3, Baal worship and all the acts associated to it. Once again, that is revived. And as is said in verse 3, it says that Manasseh worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them, which would indicate to us that there is, for whatever reason, idolatry connected to what we would call today to be the stars and planets and things like that. And this is a problem that Manasseh introduces that will continue on, apparently, for the rest of Judah's history, up until its captivity almost 100 years later. Look for a moment at Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 18. Jeremiah lived, or at least he witnessed, the captivity of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah is writing as the book and his life. He lived a lot longer, or lived a lot further down the line than what Manasseh did. So you're talking about roughly 75 years perhaps that have elapsed from Manasseh to Jeremiah. And if you look at Jeremiah 7 and verse 18, as he's talking about the worship of the people in Judah, he says that the children gather wood, the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the queen of heaven, and they pour out drink offerings to other gods that they may provoke me to anger. And we notice there in verse 18 the statement that they are at least making these cakes for the queen of heaven, which seems to indicate here that this is a similar practice, the worship of the stars, the worship of the celestial bodies. That's the same thing that Manasseh introduced in verse 4. Or introduced in verse 3 and in verse 4, that they worship the host of heaven. This is a practice that apparently continued all the way until Judah's eventual destruction. And we'll point that out again when we talk about the actual end of Manasseh's life. That's recorded for us in 2 Chronicles. But what that indicates to us is that these activities that Manasseh introduces are going to be things that do not go away. Remember that Hezekiah spent essentially all of his life trying to rid the nation of idolatry. Really the only king to do that since David. And it's only going to take the work of one king, his son, not only to undo his reforms, but to put in place a practice that God would detest that would last all the way up until the people of Judah are taken into captivity. As it said there in verse 4, he also built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said in Jerusalem, I will put my name. And he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. And so naturally, in Jeremiah 7 and verse 18, as he's talking about specifically the city of Jerusalem, we understand why Jeremiah witnessed that practice, because of Manasseh here taking the house of the Lord and building altars specifically for the worship of the host of heaven and the idolatry that was connected to it. And then in verse 6, perhaps is the more severe of all the things that are stated here that the people of Judah would have thought to be, later the righteous individuals, especially you get to the New Testament, you think about the culture of Judaism at that point, the acts that they would have certainly detested, perhaps more than any other, would have been there in verse 6, where it says that Manasseh made his son pass through the fire, practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, and consulted spiritists and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Now we understand, at least it's generally held as a consensus, that the topic of having your son pass through the fire, again, is a reference to child sacrifice. And obviously we've talked about this before, this is a practice that some of these idolatrous cultures practice because of the idea, the greater the value of whatever you sacrificed, the greater benefit the gods would give you for that. So, in essence, if you sacrifice a child, specifically if you sacrifice a son as king, potential heir to the throne, that sort of thing, that's obviously going to have a lot of significance. And in Manasseh's point, at least in Manasseh's mind, the gods that he's worshiping, that he has abandoned the Lord for, those gods perhaps in his mind would grant him a long reign, or a beneficial and a good reign as king, as long as he gave and made a sacrifice like this. Now, we know, of course, that is not what God expected of the people of Israel. Again, that's why in the book of Leviticus, where it talks about all the different sacrifices, what was required, the regulations that they had to follow, a lot of those things seem like boring details for us today. But what all those details and all those requirements showed to the people of Judah is exactly what God would want, so that they would not do something like what Manasseh is doing here and fall victim to the idea, apparently, that a lot of these Canaanite cultures and those cultures around Judah had at this point. And Manasseh, of course, ignored all of that. It said that he practiced soothsaying. used witchcraft and consulted spiritists and mediums. And we know in the Old Testament, according to the law of Moses, those who practiced this, I believe that this was one of the crimes in the civil law that fit with the punishment of the death penalty. And for a number of reasons, obviously the most significant that stands out to us would be the idea that it would abandon one's trust in the Lord. We know that the former King Saul, all the way back in 1 Samuel, did something similar after he fell out of favor with God. And we know, of course, that by consulting, as Saul did, consulting mediums, it did not benefit him at all. Again, the concept of witchcraft here, I know when you think about later on in time, the way that people interpret that, there are a lot of misinterpretations of what that actually meant. A lot of people over the course of time took the concept of witchcraft and understood it to be something that was real. We're going to mention the Puritans today in our first lesson. And when you think about early American history, one of the more significant events is, of course, the Salem witch trials, where evidently there were a lot of people in Salem and really in the Massachusetts colony who were Puritans that actually believed that witchcraft was something that was real, that people could actually practice it and manipulate nature for the work of evil people like Satan. And obviously some people still today hold to that idea. There are a lot of people that won't watch Harry Potter, won't let their kids watch Harry Potter because it focuses on wizards and witchcraft. But that's not what's going on here. The witchcraft is not anything that was real at all, like what the Puritans understood and what some people today might understand. And within all of this, evidently, based on what archaeologists and historians think, is that a lot of these practices, there was drug usage connected to it. And drug usage could obviously make people see and experience things that they felt was real but was actually not really real. And certainly for a lot of you that are in the audience today, perhaps remember, if you think about the 60s and the 70s were 2 decades in which there was especially among younger Americans, maybe not in Mississippi, but in a lot of parts of the country, it was 2 decades where there was a heavy usage of different types of drugs, and a lot of those drugs causing people to have hallucinations, and you can think about that with LSD and acid and stuff like that. But people, obviously, they take those drugs, they experience it, they're going to experience a lot of different wild things that go on in their mind, and that's just the byproduct of using drugs. More than likely, that's this activity. People feel like it's real, but in essence, they're feeling the impact of perhaps of drug usage. And obviously, that's why the Lord did not, obviously the Lord did not want that tolerated within the people of Judah, because of what we know today to be the harmful effects of a lot of those drugs. And it simply says again that he did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. And then verse 7 follows on and says, he even set a carved image of Asherah that he had made in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And to top all that off, this carved image of Asherah, which can be translated as a grove, the idea of what this is that it was a common image connected to idolatry in the Canaanite culture. And perhaps the significance of it is that Manasseh himself, it says that he had made it. Perhaps he made it himself, perhaps he ordered it to be made, but he had a direct decision placing this object in the house of the Lord to cause the people to sin. And that obviously angered the Lord because, again, I will put, as the Lord said, his design was that in the house of the Lord, the temple, I will put my name forever. And as he said, verse 8, and I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers, only if they are careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they paid no attention, and Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. Now notice again what he said there in verse 8. He said, I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers. That statement is given to us because we are keeping in mind that we are looking to the end of the book, where we're going to see that the people of Judah are going to once again wander away from their home. And that statement's significant here because it's showing that the leadership, the reign of Manasseh, even though we're going to see him change in 2 Chronicles, the source for why Judah is taken into captivity, at least a lot of the blame is being put at the feet of Manasseh for all these practices that he has introduced, to the point where the children of Israel, the nation of Judah, is much more evil, or that they did more evil than the nations that had been there before, that their ancestors were to have destroyed. And as the condition there is given to us in verse 8, that if they followed what God had said, according to what the law said, they would not wander. And that's why verse 9, it just simply says, they didn't listen. Right? They didn't pay any attention. They didn't give heed to the things that God had commanded him. And that's why the writer is using this to connect us to the end of the book, to justify what happens to the tribe of Judah, despite the good things that Hezekiah had done as king. Now, as we look at verses 1 through 9 in totality, obviously what this, and I think about the significance that is there in verse 7. The idea that Manasseh took something that was detrimental to the people, that was detrimental to himself, and he put it directly in the house of the Lord, and that in part leading to the corruption, essentially, of the rest of the society within Judah. You know, I think about that from the perspective of us as Christians. You know, we know that in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul would refer to the body of Christ. He would refer to Christians in the sense as the temple of the Lord. And I think about the significance of that comparison and that analogy as it pertains here. We become Christians, obviously, the idea is that we want, you know, metaphorically, we want God to put His name in us forever, right? We want to be known as the children of God forever. That's what we want whenever we convert and we obey the gospel and we try to live faithful to Him. And what this is showing us is that we can take, if we allow one thing, if we take one thing, in this case, as you know, Manasseh did a lot of things, but he took the one thing, verse 7, he took the carved image of Asherah and decided to put it in the temple of the Lord. And that one act, along with the other acts, eventually led the entire population to lead a sinful life. And I think the point can be made for us too, that we have to be careful that we're not taking the things of this world, and even it can be one very small thing that is inherently sinful, we've got to be careful not to take that object and to put it in our heart, because that's going to lead, obviously, to us engaging in sinful activity. It's going to lead us to being corrupted, perhaps on a scale that's much larger than what we think. At least in my mind, that's what stands out to me as I read through this and I think about what Manasseh does here. This one act of taking something and putting it in the temple in the heart of Jerusalem to replace the Lord made everybody a lot worse. As Christians, whenever we do that, even if it's not something inherently sinful, we take one thing, we put it in our heart, we set our heart on it, all of a sudden one day we're not going to have the heart to want to follow after God. That stands out in my mind as an application for what Manasseh has done here as a warning to us. Now, with that being said, are there any comments on what we've said up through verse 9?
As you indicated, it didn't take long for Manasseh to undo all the good his dad had done, which reminds us it's really easier to tear down, especially in the realm of religion, than it is to build up.
Right.
And you got a picture of all restraints being removed. Whatever he wanted to do, he did it. Sort of parallels Romans 1, the picture of the Gentiles who drifted further and further away from God as they removed restraints from their mind and just kept going down and down and down. Just again, a reminder: it just doesn't take long to undo all the good that had been done.
Right. Yeah, this is going to be a progressional. It's quick, but it's also a progressional step, if we think about it in that way, a progressional declining in terms of the morality of the people. And God's response in verse 10 is that this activity is not going to go unnoticed. Verse 10, it said that the Lord spoke by his servants, the prophets, saying, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has done these abominations. In other words, he has acted more wickedly than all the Amorites who were before him, and has also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both of his ears will tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria, and the plummet of the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. So I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and deliver them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become victims of plunder to all their enemies, because they have done evil in my sight and have provoked me to anger since the day their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. So God's response is that this level of corruption is something that, and as we see later on, does not completely go away. This level of corruption is something that God's got to completely get rid of. And again, unfortunately, it results in the people's captivity. And the idea behind captivity, of course, is that one day when God promised that the people would return, that the people the people would have learned that when God says that there are consequences for these types of activities that you're engaging in, God's not kidding about it, right? God's not bluffing about it. Their ancestors know that when they go into captivity and they struggle to get back to their homeland. They're going to know that. Manasseh and the people in his days perhaps did not think much that there would actually be consequences. Now, I know, of course, Israel has already been destroyed, but there have been other times in Judah's history where under Athaliah, under Ahaz, some of these activities went on and God had not punished the people. And thus Manasseh and some of these people perhaps thought that they could continue dwelling in that. But God said that that's not going to be the case. Notice that he says in verse 12 that the calamity that's going to come upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both of his ears will tingle. Now, what's God saying there? What's the idea of a person's ears being tingled?
Astonished.
We can get that from the word. We can get from this word the idea of somebody being astonished, almost unbelievable. Certainly, the people of Judah, as they're led into captivity, when they experience this, they're certainly going to be astonished, but not in a good way at all. Now, obviously, this also would reference the perspective of other nations when they hear that the people of God, Judah, had been destroyed. And if you think about it from the perspective of the inhabitants of Judah directly, their ears probably did not tingle when men like Isaiah, men like Jeremiah, men like the prophets mentioned in verse 10 spoke to them to try to get them to straighten up, right? They didn't think that there was any significance in what those prophets said. But in verse 12, they're going to realize the significance once they see their own destruction. And as he said in verse 13, to a level similar to what happened with Samaria. with the kingdom of Israel. I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I don't know if you've ever gone to a restaurant and you have sat down and ordered something to eat. But one of the things that would be very disgusting to me is that if I ordered something to eat, so if I go and I order, I don't know, fried chicken, and I get a plate of fried chicken, I got sides with it or whatever, and I get my plate, it's set down, and on that plate I can still see that there are stains of fish on it, right? Now I like fish, but I would not want to eat, I wouldn't want to eat fish that probably has been there that hadn't been washed off, right? And if you think about cleaning dishes, we understand why we do that, or at least why dishes have to be cleaned to a very intense degree, right? Because we like the idea of cleanliness. We don't want disease and things like that. And so we clean our dishes and we try to do that really well. And what God's saying here is that just as people like a clean dish, right? They're going to take the time to scrub it. They're going to take the time to let it soak if it needs to soak. That way that you can get whatever residue of the food or oil that was in there, whatever it takes to get it off, you're going to do that. And that's what God's saying here about Jerusalem. Jerusalem as a dish, I'm going to make sure that it is thoroughly wiped away. Now, that is certainly a reference to the 3 successive waves, perhaps, of Judah's captivity, because Babylon will come in 3 successive waves, broken apart by about 10 years each. And by the time that 3rd wave is through, Jerusalem is essentially wiped clean. Much like what God is predicting will happen here. As one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. It's going to be thoroughly clean. Jerusalem's going to be thoroughly stripped by the time that I am through with that. So again, that I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance, deliver them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become victims of plunder to all their enemies. Now we know, of course, that God allows His people to suffer in captivity. The idea of forsaking the remnant, when we keep this in its context, is talking about He's going to finally allow Babylon to take His people into captivity. A promise that He said had, essentially had been coming, but now He's finally going to do it. He's not going to completely forsake them, as we find out in books like Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah. Notice that they shall become victims of plunder to all their enemies. Certainly we might think here about the people of Edom. We know that the book of Obadiah, for instance, is written to the people of Edom, who following the destruction of Jerusalem saw the demise of Judah as a great thing. The people of Edom wanted to take advantage of the fact that now there is no power in Jerusalem. And Obadiah through inspiration, wrote that book as a warning to Edom to not rejoice in Judah's death. The point is that there were going to be a lot of people, the enemies of God, who were going to rejoice in Judah's demise. And we know that when the captives come back from captivity, that they are going to have to do a lot of work trying to restore Judah as as a nation built on the idea of serving God. It's going to take a lot of work for that to happen. And all that, of course, because it's said in verse 15, they have done a lot of evil. They have provoked the Lord to anger. In verse 16 adds a final statement. It says, "Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides his sin, by which he made Judah sin, in doing evil in the sight of the Lord." Now we know from the book of Proverbs that one of the things that God hates is what? Hands or he who sheds innocent blood. And the Bible records here that Manasseh didn't just shed innocent blood, but it said that he shed very much innocent blood. Now, there's not a lot of detail given in that. Perhaps what this is a reference to is to all those that opposed the reforms that Manasseh had implemented, those that had been faithful to Hezekiah, those that had, or at least those that were trying to do the right thing, that when Manasseh had to make a decision about what to do with his critics, Manasseh perhaps thought that the only option was by taking their wife. And sometimes in the Old Testament, we certainly know when we get to the time of Jesus, and as he compares the Pharisees to those who had slain the prophets in the Old Testament, we know that this is something that God obviously did not like. The shedding of innocent blood, perhaps here being the shedding of innocent blood, innocent, those that were trying to do the right thing, that Manasseh could not tolerate because of his design to set in motion wicked practices. Just as Jesus would harshly give some points of criticism towards the Pharisees who spiritually were leading the people away from God. And so God detested the idea of it. Manasseh, naturally, like what his religion led him into, continued this practice as well. So that Manasseh is ultimately remembered as a very, very wicked king. Now in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, it records more about the story of Manasseh. Basically, 2 Kings, if we were to only conclude with 2 Kings 21, we would seem to think that Manasseh lived and died as a very, very wicked person. But if you look at 2 Chronicles 33 in verse 10, we read that Manasseh actually had a change of heart later on in life. And it took a significant event to cause him to change. And we'll only go down to verse 13, and this will be where we start next week, but we'll introduce it now. 2 Chronicles 33 and verse 10, it says that the Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they would not listen. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze fetters, and carried him off to Babylon. Now when he was in affliction, he implored the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, and prayed to him, and he received his entreaty, heard his supplication, and brought him back to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. We know that sometimes it takes a traumatic event for somebody to straighten up. We know that that is the case when it comes to, we know that can happen, for instance, whenever somebody passes away. If it's a loved one who passes away, we know that can be the case if somebody gets into an accident or some type of experience where they almost die. We often refer to it as a wake-up call. And Manasseh, what he experiences as he's led into captivity, is this is going to be his wake-up call. Now, the unfortunate thing about it is that this wake-up call, specifically for the people of Judah, is going to come too late. Because by the time that we get to 2 Kings 25, the bad things that Manasseh had introduced, that all of those things had not yet gone away. And that will help explain why Judah is destroyed as it is. We're out of time this morning. Thank you for your time and your attention. We're actually going to pick up in 2 Chronicles 33 and in this section in verse 10 next week to finish out the life of Manasseh. But thank you for your time and your attention.